to the Marshall Center Voices. I'm Valbona Zeneli. In this episode, we'll interview Dr. Anna Wieslander. She is the chair of the Swedish Institute for Security and Development Policy. At the same time, she is the director for Northern Europe of the Atlantic Council. Anna, we're delighted to have you with us today as part of the Marshall Center Voices.
Thank you for having me.
Anna, you are one of the best scholars in Europe when it comes to transatlantic relations. And that's why I'd like to start this conversation with this very important topic. When we speak about transatlantic relations, we all know that we need to consider into the discussion the hype and emotions. So from your perspective, what is the most accurate picture when it comes to transatlantic relations today? And also, what is the difference between perceptions and reality on the ground?
Well, thank you so much, Valbona, for having me. And I think this question is really key to start with. No doubt, the transatlantic relations have been strained during these past years, and these tensions have underlined trust across the Atlantic. But there has been a complex picture of American support and engagement in Europe during these years. On the military side, the Trump administration has done a lot, actually, investing in more troops on the ground, in infrastructure, preposition of material, a lot of exercises. Politically, there has been much more turbulence on NATO, on trade, on leaving the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran deal, and the whole approach to the liberal world order and the multilateral institutions have caused a lot of discussion. So I believe on substance, there has been both plus and minuses, but overall there has been complications and a drift across the Atlantic. And that's also reflected by more calls in Europe for greater strategic autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Very good points. So with what you're explaining, so how do you see this relationship evolving with the incoming US administration? And also, if you were to offer some advices on viable solutions on how to reconcile the relationships, what would those be?
Well, with the Biden presidency, we can expect you can say better tone of voice across the Atlantic, as well as a stronger preference to work together to solve global issues and challenges. And to my mind, this is actually crucial. We need to have a common approach in the West, if the US and Europe working together to defend the interests of the West and also the values of the West: democracy, free trade, protection of human rights, freedom of speech, and so on. And this emphasis on alliances and partners and values with the new administration, I think that will provide a good common ground to define a new transatlantic agenda. One very important part of such an agenda is for Europe to step up and assume more responsibility. And Europe is often perceived to talk a lot, but to not do so much. I think that really has to change. I would like to see Europe coming together and perhaps put suggestions now on the new administration's table, to be more proactive and say, this is what we propose, what are your views? How can we work together? Be more forward-leaning, and not only on security defense, but also on trade, on digital issues, on the climate part. So there are several issues where we can be the ones initiating also policy from Europe's side, and not only moving back into a comfort zone, so to say, of the old school.
Very, very good point. And actually, you mentioned democracy, values, things that maybe for a very long time we have taken for granted. And so we have to pay more attention to what unites us in the transatlantic scene. We realize that we live in a new era of a great power competition. So do you think there is a full understanding of such a thing among the European leaders?
Power competition, I believe that there is a rising awareness of it, and a more and more congruent view with Americans on the challenges ahead. Perhaps we have been targeted differently or affected differently by this increasing competition, but you can see the language changing, and more European leaders coming together on raised awareness on, for instance, the intentions of China. I think Russia is one thing. We have handled Russia for a long time on this continent. We know Russia pretty well. China is newer. China has come to Europe much more
more recently,
during these past years. And that has first, we just saw it from an economic point of view. Now I think we see all kinds of implications for China's new presence in Europe, which also has to do with security, for instance, technology, and so on.
Absolutely. If you were to describe briefly, what do you see as the main security challenges that Europe is facing, let's say, in the next 20 or 30 years?
Well, I believe this great power competition is the new era we are entering, and how it will play out for us, we will have to see, but we cannot count out the involvement. Russia is where it is. We will always have to deal with Russia. And then China will be a rising power and perhaps surpass the US economically when it comes to gross national product. We don't know, but a lot of people estimate that will happen. So that we need to realize. And then the global great power competition game will spread out and basically be everywhere. So that's a new game that we have to learn. We see how that works also. It has not only to do with economic or military means, it's also a lot about disinformation, of winning the narrative, of being active also in the cyberspace, or in space even. So new domains that are involved in this. And it's not only wartime, it's a lot going on in peacetime. So we need to focus on building strong resilience in societies and being aware on that side. And then we also will continue most likely to have fragile states in the Middle East and in Africa, and also great population growth, and the pressures that puts on Europe. And there are a lot of dimensions of that, but security is one dimension of that, and linked also to some extent to extremism and terrorism, which will, I think, will be with us as well.
You raised very good points when it comes to some of the main security challenges that Europe is facing. But we also know that not all European countries share those threats equally. Let's say scholars talk about a certain regionalization of the security challenges in Europe. Do you see that as a challenge? Do you think that maybe countries are focusing too much on their regional challenges and losing the picture, the bigger picture?
The most important thing to preserve peace in Europe is unity. And in that sense, you need to have a shared sense of destiny. On the other hand, you will never reach, I think it's hard to perceive a situation where everyone has exactly the same level of threat, or perceived threats equally, because we have different history, we are differently located geographically, we have various size of the countries and capabilities and so on. But so therefore, a shared assessment process serves multiple functions, actually, to my mind. Those most affected get to explain and get an understanding from others on their situation. You reach awareness in that sense. And that facilitates, in turn, solidarity among actors in order to maintain this unity that we need in order to be strong enough to meet these threats together. And then also it helps doing the priorities we need to do in order to match resources and capabilities in order to meet them efficiently as well. So all of this goes together. And I think we have good examples actually of joint threat assessments within NATO. So NATO countries, in even adding on close partner countries such as Sweden and Finland, have worked on the Baltic Sea region and created joint threat assessments, which are then updated frequently. There have been similar assessments for the Black Sea region, for instance, and I foresee you can do that for the Arctic. So you can work on regional situations, but you need to involve the greater framework in the understanding of that particular.
Absolutely, and you rightly pointed out unity and solidarity when it comes to the European common foreign and security policy. And you also mentioned NATO, which we know that as we think of NATO as the main provider for the European security, in your opinion, how much will the non-US NATO members address the argument that they're not paying enough for Europe's defense? And also, actually, have we learned anything from the last 4 years? So, in order to move ahead, or there'll be a tendency that maybe we'll just go back to business as usual?
Well, I strongly believe that NATO needs to develop more of a European pillar within its organization. And I think the alternative would be to develop more of defense and security within the EU and more independently from NATO. I don't think that's attractive for most European states, actually. Mm-hmm. But what does a European pillar contain? We need to be more specific on that. And to my mind, it has both a political dimension, and there, the UK is important, even if they have left the EU. So I'm not talking about the EU caucus, but a broader discussion. So you have other members like Norway, for instance, who also are European states. But perhaps more of political consultations and links to the EU within the NATO discussion on the political side. And then on the military side, you need to have a very strong and good coordination between capability development within the EU. You will have the innovation projects, you will have the PESCO projects. And how is that linked to the NATO framework? We need to be, it is in theory, but there is a lot of work to do, I think, filling the gaps. How can the EU be useful in this? When we talk about military mobility, how do we build this together within the, what do we know from NATO that is useful for the EU, and how can the EU feed back into NATO? So we need to take more responsibility, but we also need to stop talking and start building the structures that will provide us with the resources we need to be more as a strong and senior partner to the US on security, and not least when it comes to our own security here on this continent.
Very good point. And actually, there are initiatives out there in terms of NATO-EU cooperation, but as you mentioned, there is need for better implementation of those initiatives. But as you mentioned, there is also a lot of talk in Europe among the European leaders regarding European strategic autonomy or European sovereignty. What does it really mean? And is Europe ready to become a hard power? Because as we know, that requires time and also resources.
Yes, strategic autonomy came up, actually. It's about the ability for the EU to act on its own when necessary. And I think for most European states, that means when the US does not want to or cannot act in this way to provide the leadership. The concept is connected to the EU's ambition to become more of a global actor in line with its global strategy from 2016, which explicitly mentions this concept as well. And when you talk about perhaps the EU being active outside of its territory, it's easier to understand how those mechanisms could work and what you would need, strategic airlift or communication and so on. Well, it becomes more blurry when it goes to capability development, to innovation and technology, which can also be used for national or collective defense, so then it becomes a bit of a competition situation here between the EU and NATO, largely, and more difficult to understand what really this is about, the planning and so on.
And maybe there's also a need for a better strategic communication because the public does not understand those blurry lines that you were just explaining.
No, exactly. I mean, it's difficult to explain what's defense in one way or defense in another. For everyone, it's defense, and you have the resources for it, and you use it. So there, I think we need to be wary on what is it that we are talking about, and be serious about what it is we want to develop, and not only have concepts that we tend to throw out, that it would be good for Europe to have a European army, for instance, or so on. when it comes down to it, for most countries, these are the same soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
What do we mean? You know, they're national resources that we are just grouping in various ways, and it's for most countries strained resources. Where we can't develop everything that can go outside of the EU and others to defend ourselves. It has to be, we have to be able to use it, and we have to make priorities, and that's also, I think, important. The other thing that is important in this aspect is to have a dialogue with the US on strategic autonomy. And there we have not been very successful so far in having, what would be strategic autonomy does not mean that the US will leave Europe, or that no one wants the US in Europe. It means it's a question of degrees, not 1-0.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to have a common understanding across the Atlantic also of a so-called a calibrated level of strategic autonomy, and a common understanding of what that means. And we do not have that today. It's also about defense industry and autonomy. And with COVID-19, we have seen even more expansion of this autonomy discussions to other sectors as well, mm-hmm. Industrial and supply chain and health and so on. So this is, as it is now, a very big discussion, which needs to be addressed seriously, I think, also with the incoming Biden administration.
You mentioned European army. Does the Europe have the resources or the capacities, capabilities to create an army? It was kind of a buzzword for some times over the last few years.
I'm pretty critical against these buzzwords. They are used by politicians making, visionary speeches. But what is this actually, and how helpful is it? I don't think it is very helpful, because it leads the mind to something that is, as you indicate, very costly. And who has it? And for what are we going to use a European army? No one has answers to these questions. So you should be careful about using these kind of notions that carry a lot of history but has never actually been realized. And I don't know how much they make sense to the public, or how much they just confuse what is it we want to do, and what do we want to achieve, and against which threats are we supposed to defend ourselves. I think that those are more important issues, and to connect to the worries and the concerns of the public in that way.
You mentioned the public, and that's a very good point in terms of communicating with the public. Wouldn't that make more sense that politicians in Europe communicated to the public more widely and deeply regarding the necessity to increase defense resources for NATO, for example?
Yeah, I think that's something that we really need to work on, communication with the public. It has to do with, if you see some public opinion polls now, some would view the US as a bigger threat than Russia, for instance. And I think that has to do with lack of communication from the political leadership to the public on what is actually going on here. And you might say that there are multiple sources of information that a citizen can get nowadays with social media. You can, perhaps you don't listen to authorities the same way as you used to, or you don't take in information in traditional ways the way you used to. But that doesn't make it less important to actually work with those things. On the contrary, I think we need to do much more. Also in this period of post-Cold War peace that we had for quite a long time, 20-25 years, we kind of forgot that territory matters, and that borders actually matter, and that defending our institutions matter. We took all that for granted. And now it has come back to us, the new era of geopolitics, as we talk about, or geoeconomics. And we need to educate the public also on what does that mean, and what does that require from us and from each one of us. And that it has not only to do with a future situation of war, but that it's ongoing right now in the information sphere and in the cyber sphere, and that we need to be resilient to a much larger extent.
Mm-hmm. It looks like we had the understanding that we're going back to those traditional threats that, as you mentioned, we had forgotten about since 2014. But do we have awareness in the European public about those traditional threats that you're mentioning?
think we increasingly have it, but still that there is a lack of sense of urgency across many countries. And even those that are mostly bordering, for instance, to Russia feel and have a history where they have been existentially threatened as states. Of course, there I think there is good awareness and concern. But for many other countries, and there is not this kind of understanding that we need. And we also need to understand that if we feel an increased threat or a situation in the world where we have less of security and more things going on, small conflicts easily getting sparked up, it takes time to develop the capabilities that we need. These are big investments. So if you look at capability development, you have to look 10, 15 years ahead. So we cannot switch this overnight. It has to be a steady course and work with. A lot of discussion has been going on, the effects of COVID-19 on national budgets. And it's very important to understand that short-term effects cannot decide the long-term investments that we need in order to meet these systemic changes that the world now is facing.
You bring me to a very good point when it comes to the great power competition, and that's China. We all know that Chinese economic presence in Europe has increased tremendously since the financial crisis of 2008. And there's also speculation that Beijing is determined to make Europe central to its globalization strategy. But in this framework, it also looks like Beijing is trying to wage a divide and conquer approach when it comes to dealing with Europe, both economically and politically. And here we have in mind platforms such as Belt and Road Initiative or 17+1. So do you think we have unity in Europe, or will we have that in the future when it comes to dealing with China?
Well, there has to be unity in order for us to have a prosperous future. I think there is no alternative for Europe. And you can have discussions and quarrels and perhaps disagreement and so on. But in the end, we need to stay united. And dealing with China will be a major challenge in this regard. I think there is an increased awareness that China is playing this a bit of a divide and rule game, that it is to their advantage, so to say, in order for them to pursue Chinese interests and what they need. And I think from European side, we need to understand both that politically it can be, if you have too much of it has to be a two-way dialogue. Also, if you have too much coming in from Brussels from above, that is not only always well perceived by national governments, and there can also be a cost that we need to pay. That could be a higher price on unity, so to say, when it comes to bringing incentives to certain countries. In order, we might not be able to set the price totally on our own, but in comparison or in light with that, if this does not happen from a European effort, China will come in and fund it. And what does that mean coming about infrastructure, for instance, control and so on? So we might need to look at it differently in that sense as well, that there might come with a higher cost of keeping the unity. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to be very open to all of this and have discussions. So we will not there will be a persuasive element to this, I think, to stick to unity and to be solidaric. It's very important for each nation to be aware of this, but also that we might be able to have to change the incentives for creating this unity. There are a range of instruments within the EU, for instance, structural funds and so on.
Actually offering maybe more economic, as you mentioned, incentives to Southern European countries that have become, over the last few years, part of the Chinese platforms, such as Belt and Road or 17+1. Also, in your opinion, when it comes to opportunities for better transatlantic cooperation vis-a-vis China, where do you see opportunities and where do you see some of the obstacles for this to happen?
Well, this is a very good question, because the China agenda, so to say, we should have been able to come much further. And to my mind, I don't see any major. There should not be any major obstacles because the US and Europe are so much aligned on many issues on how to deal with this. We want free trade, we want equal market opportunities, we don't want currency manipulation, we don't want we want immaterial rights to be protected. We have a range of issues that we want to pursue, and we should be able to do that jointly. And I think by that we can be a stronger partner to deal with China and to make these corrections to Chinese behavior that will create more of equal terms and better cooperation ahead. Mm-hmm. So this is pretty urgent.
As you say, there are so many more things that unite us transatlantically when it comes to dealing with China. Why are we focusing on what divides us?
I think there has been two things, basically. One is a different approach to the security threat from China. The US is much more involved in Asia than Europe is, so we have a different outlook in that sense. We don't feel or sense our military threat from that region is further away for Europe. So the lack of urgency, as we discussed earlier, as also when it comes to China, it's hard for us exactly to see why would this be a security threat for us. And in that way, the US and Europe has been looking at this differently. I think increasingly Europe has understood the US way of looking at it, and also perhaps increased feeling ourselves that where will this land and will this actually affect us as well? Why are the Chinese doing this or that? You have had more of an aggressive Chinese approach also to issues, louder and more pushing issues, which has made Europe react to this. But then, of course, there is the question of economic interest, that we have so much trade with China. It's important for European production. It's also a very important market for selling, for consumption, with a pretty growing Chinese middle class that can pay for European goods. So we are interlinked with China to a big extent economically, and that of course comes with difficult decisions in shaping this kind of agenda. Doesn't make it impossible. I think there are lots of common ground to work forward on, but you have to realize these issues, that they are we might not be able to do business as we have done it, and we have to perhaps think anew, but it should be doable, to my view, because there's so many things that unite us.
And you know, the objective is to really create a fair, level playing field for economic activities, not only in Europe and the United States, but globally. And that's the aim that we should have also with China, bringing that and take to the table. You mentioned also before that there is evidence, quite a lot of evidence actually, that the Chinese Communist Party has attempted to exploit the COVID-19 pandemic in Europe through large disinformation campaigns. And so my question for you is, do you think the European institutions and European member states are prepared, are well equipped to deal with those large disinformation campaigns?
Well, that's a very good question. I think we have come a bit on our way in order to handle disinformation campaigns, in that we recognize when they are ongoing, and we do it faster than we did before. There are some attempts to meet it and to recognize this, to lift it up. The transparency is very important, to say that this is what's going on now. China is doing this and that. You have to put it up in the light and show it also to the public that it's going on, and we have been doing that. But having said that, I still think there is a lot missing. We do not provide that much of resources. There are very few people. If you look at the EU institutions, it's a small group of people working with this information. For instance, in each country, we still have a build-up, I think, of meeting this, and you need to have common messages on how to meet it, what's going on, how do you want to meet it. You have to coordinate between capitals and also between the EU and NATO to a large extent, and perhaps also be more offensive in the way that you provide counter facts and narratives of not only defending yourself, but also telling us what's the good part of our story. If you have a battle of narratives, for instance. And then in the end, you always have to meet a battle of narratives with concrete results that are in democracies made tangible for the public, because then in the end you will have the accountability. So it needs to follow all the way through. So I think we're in a good start. I would say we have come some way in this past, say, 4 or 5 years, but still a lot of that can be done. And to me, this is a key issue, actually. It has coming back to resilience. I think as we look at defense and security ahead, this is where we really have to put a lot of focus, because as the effects of conflicts escalating into any kind of military measures will be so devastating with all the new technologies also that we see. Having this strong peacetime build-up is very, very important for us when it comes to both disinformation and cyber, for instance.
As you said, we should not forget what makes us strong, which is really the values and democracy of our countries. So thank you so much. It was great to have you with us today, and we hope to see you soon at the Marshall Center. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope to see you soon too. Thank you.
This concludes the Marshall Center Voices. Until next time, stay tuned and stay well.